Garbage man spots crying woman taking out trash, panics when he sees what the press crushed. The early morning air carried the scent of damp pavement and diesel as the garbage truck rumbled down Sycamore Lane, its headlights cutting through the dim haze of dawn. The neighborhood was still half asleep, windows dark, curtains drawn, and only a few porch lights flickering from houses where someone had already started their day. It was an ordinary morning for Tommy Callahan, a veteran garbage collector who had worked this route for nearly 15 years. Tommy was built like a man who had spent his life lifting heavy things. His hands were rough from years of gripping trash bins, his back strong despite the strain. At 52, his knees ached more than they used to, but he didn't complain. This job paid the bills, kept his mind occupied, and let him move through life without getting too close to anyone. He liked it that way. His partner for the morning shift, Miguel Santos, a wiry man in his 30s with a quick wit and an even quicker temper, was already complaining about the cold. "I swear, Tommy, one day I'm gonna quit this gig and move somewhere warm," Miguel muttered, rubbing his hands together as he hopped off the truck to grab the first set of bins. "You've been saying that for 5 years, Miguel," Tommy said with a chuckle, stepping down and joining him. "If I had $1 for every time you swore you were moving to Florida, I could retire already." Miguel smirked, flipping open a bin lid.
"Yeah, well,
maybe today's the day." He heaved the trash into the back of the truck, the mechanical press grinding as it compacted the waste. "Then again, I'd miss all this fresh-smelling luxury." Tommy was about to reply when movement caught his eye. A woman stood at the end of a cracked driveway, struggling with a large black trash bag. She was barefoot, her long, dark hair tangled from the wind. Even in the dim light, he could see the tear tracks on her face. She wasn't just tired, she was devastated. Something about the way she clutched that bag, the way her fingers trembled against the plastic, sent a ripple of unease through Tommy. He had seen people throw away all kinds of things, worn-out furniture, broken appliances, old clothes, but there was something different about this. The woman looked up, her eyes locking onto Tommy's. Desperation, fear, and something else. She took a step forward, as if she wanted to say something. But then she stopped. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she quickly dropped the bag onto the curb and turned away, wrapping her arms around herself as she hurried back toward her house. Tommy hesitated, watching her retreating figure. Miguel, oblivious, grabbed the bag and tossed it onto the truck's lift. "Hey, you good man?" "Yeah," Tommy murmured, but his gaze lingered on the woman. The hydraulic press engaged, the mechanical groan of crushing waste filling the air. Tommy turned back just in time to see something unusual, something that didn't belong, peek out from the bag just before it disappeared into the compactor. A flash of fabric. A tiny hand. Tommy's blood ran cold. His body moved before his mind could catch up. "Stop the press," he barked, his voice sharper than it had been in years. Miguel jumped back. "What the hell?" But Tommy was already climbing onto the side of the truck, reaching toward the tangled mass of trash before it could be swallowed whole. His fingers grasped at the plastic, ripping through the bag, and then his stomach lurched. Inside the bag, half crushed by the force of the compactor, was a baby doll. Not just a doll, a realistic baby doll, dressed in tiny pajamas, with delicate eyelashes and fingers curled, as if it had been reaching for something. For a split second, Tommy thought it was real. His hands trembled as he pulled it free, his breath caught in his throat. It took a moment before his brain registered that it wasn't alive, that it wasn't a child. Miguel exhaled sharply. "Damn, man. You scared me." "Thought you found a..." He shook his head. "It's just a doll." Tommy swallowed hard, his pulse still pounding in his ears. "Just a doll. Just a toy. So, why did it feel so wrong?" He looked back toward the house. The woman was gone. But something told him this wasn't over. This wasn't just a doll. And that woman, whoever she was hiding something. And Tommy Callahan wasn't the kind of man to just walk away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood, Jake Thompson, a seasoned garbage man, couldn't shake the unease that gripped him. The sight of the crying woman, Sarah, haunted him, but it was what he found in the trash compactor that sent ice through his veins. Wedged between bags of refuse and discarded items, a tattered baby blanket peeked out from the crushed garbage. Something about it made Jake's heart race. He hesitated, glancing around before pulling the fabric free. Beneath it, he found a tiny stuffed rabbit, worn, dirted, but unmistakably a child's favorite. His breath hitched. Then he saw it, a small, delicate hand sticking out from the compacted trash. Jake staggered backward, ball rising in his throat. He reached for his radio, fingers shaking. "Dispatch, this is Route 14, emergency at Greenview Apartments." "Possible," he choked on the words. "Possible infant in the trash." The radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice responded. "Repeat that, Thompson." "Did you say?" Jake didn't wait. He lunged forward, using all his strength to pull apart the compressed garbage. The hand belonged to a baby, a real, living baby, its body wedged between broken boxes and discarded food. It wasn't moving. Panic surged through him. He had seen a lot in his years on the job, but nothing like this. With trembling hands, he cleared debris from the child's face and checked for breathing. A weak, shallow gasp escaped the baby's lips. It was alive. Barely. He scooped the tiny, frail body into his arms. The child couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Who would do this? And why? Sirens blared in the distance as the paramedics arrived. Sarah, the woman who had been crying near the dumpster, rushed forward, eyes wide with horror. Is the baby?" Her voice cracked. Jake didn't know what to think. Was she responsible? Did she throw the child away? Or had she been trying to stop someone else? "Ma'am," a police officer stepped in, his voice firm. "We need to ask you some questions." Sarah shook her head frantically. "No, I wasn't." She turned to Jake, pleading. "Please, you have to believe me." As the baby was rushed to the hospital, the police questioned Sarah. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I heard something crying in the dumpster. I thought it was a cat. When I looked inside, I saw the baby, but I panicked. I didn't know what to do." "Do you know who put the baby there?" the officer asked. Sarah hesitated. Her lips quivered as tears streamed down her face. She clenched her fists. "I think I know." Jake and the officers exchanged glances. "Who?" She took a shaky breath. "My landlord's wife, Celeste Warren." A stunned silence fell over the group. Celeste Warren, the elegant wife of local businessman Richard Warren, was known for her charity work and social events. What possible reason could she have to dispose of a baby? As the police began their investigation, Jake couldn't shake his suspicions. The next day, he made a trip to the Warrens' house, where a maid hesitated before letting him in. He spotted Celeste in the living room, her usual poise replaced with nervous tension. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said coolly. Jake crossed his arms. "A baby was found in the trash last night." Celeste's eyes widened, but only for a second. Then she composed herself, forcing a smile. "That's tragic. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you?" Jake pressed. Celeste stood. "That's an outrageous accusation." Jake noticed something then, a baby monitor on the coffee table. Its screen flickered. In the background, a faint sound, a baby's cry. His heart pounded. If the abandoned baby was hers, then who was crying upstairs? The impossible choice meanwhile, Sarah had done her own digging. That evening, she met Jake outside the hospital. "I found something," she whispered, shoving a folder into his hands. Inside were adoption papers, with Celeste Warren's name on them. "She adopted a baby girl a month ago," Sarah said. "But the adoption was rushed, no legal oversight." Jake frowned. "Then why would she throw the baby away?" "That's what's weird," Sarah murmured. "Because the records show she adopted twins." Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. If Celeste had twins, but only one baby was found in the trash, where was the other child? Jake called the police. As they raided the Warrens' mansion, Celeste screamed, clawing at the officers. "You don't understand," she shrieked. "I had no choice." Jake rushed upstairs, following the sound of faint whimpering. In a lavish nursery, he found a bassinet with a second baby inside. A nurse at the hospital later confirmed it. The twins were identical. One had been thrown away like garbage, while the other was kept as a prized possession. The truth came out. Celeste had only wanted one baby. She had convinced her husband to adopt, but when she realized she couldn't handle two, she decided to get rid of one. She didn't even want to give her up for adoption, Jake muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. She just threw her away. Sarah shuddered. What kind of mother does that? Celeste was arrested, charged with attempted murder and child endangerment. The Warrens' reputation crumbled overnight. Richard Warren, furious and humiliated, filed for divorce and cut all ties with his wife. The twins were placed in protective custody. Jake couldn't stop thinking about them.
Who would take care of them now?
That's when Sarah stepped forward. I want to apply for custody, she said softly. Jake looked at her in surprise. Are you sure? Tears welled in her eyes. No child deserves to feel unwanted. Months later, Sarah was granted legal guardianship of the girls. Jake visited often, playing the role of their honorary uncle. As he held the baby he had saved, she reached for his beard, giggling. Jake felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, he had been meant to find that trash bag after all. The sound of Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she clutched the phone, her fingers trembling. They're moving the baby, she whispered into the receiver. Celeste must have figured out the police are onto her. Jake, gripping the steering wheel of his truck, swerved onto the main road.
I'm almost there, he said.
The weight of what was happening pressed down on him. If Celeste managed to flee, they might never see that baby again. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder. The police had been alerted, but they were minutes behind. Jake knew from experience that a few minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Where is she now? He asked. Sarah, watching from her hiding spot behind a parked car outside the Warren estate, saw Celeste's tall figure emerge from the mansion, bundled in a heavy coat. In her arms, she cradled the tiny baby, swaddled in a thick blanket. She's heading to her car, Sarah murmured. Jake, she's getting away. Jake reached the Warrens' property just as Celeste opened the door of her sleek black SUV. He barely had time to park his truck before she slipped into the driver's seat. Without thinking, he jumped out and ran straight for her. Celeste, stop. She froze, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her eyes flashed with fear and something else, defiance. Get away from my car, Jake, she warned. You don't understand. I understand more than you think, he countered. I know you threw your own child away. I know you didn't want both of them. He took a step closer. And now you're running, because you know the truth is out. Celeste's lips curled into a bitter smile. You have no idea what kind of world I live in. People like me don't get second chances after a mistake like this. Her voice wavered, but her grip on the steering wheel tightened. Jake saw it then, the baby squirming under the blanket. He took another step forward, hands raised. You don't have to do this. It's not too late to do the right thing. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in her expression. Regret. Maybe even guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Move, she ordered, turning the key in the ignition. Jake had seconds to decide. As the SUV roared to life, he lunged forward, gripping the handle of the passenger door. Don't do this, Celeste. Sarah ran from her hiding place, shouting, Celeste, please. Just give us the baby. Celeste's breathing was ragged. You don't understand what it's like to be in my position. I didn't ask for twins, I only wanted one. The agency forced me to take both, but I can't. I just can't. Her voice cracked. Jake saw an opening. Then let her go, he said softly. You don't have to carry this anymore. Tears welled in Celeste's eyes, her face crumbling. Her grip on the baby loosened. But just as it seemed like she might surrender, the blaring sound of sirens grew deafening. Celeste panicked. She hit the gas. Jake barely had time to react as the SUV lurched forward, the tires screeching against the pavement. He dove out of the way, hitting the ground hard as the car sped toward the open gates. Sarah screamed. She's getting away. Jake, groaning from the impact, rolled onto his knees and reached for his radio. Block all exits. She's heading southbound. But then, a sharp crack. The sound of impact rang out as Celeste's SUV slammed into the side of a police cruiser that had pulled in to block her escape. The force of the crash sent her vehicle skidding sideways before coming to a jarring stop. Silence. Then, a baby's cry. Officers swarmed the scene, weapons drawn. Jake and Sarah rushed forward as the doors were yanked open. Celeste was slumped over the wheel, dazed but conscious. Her face was streaked with tears. The baby, still cradled in her arms, wailed loudly. A female officer gently reached in, carefully lifting the child from Celeste's grasp. The moment her arms were empty, Celeste let out a sob, deep, raw, filled with the weight of everything she had done. She choked on her words. I was trying to fix it. I thought if I ran. Jake shook his head, staring at her. You almost cost that baby her life. Celeste closed her eyes, her body shaking. I know. The officers led her away in handcuffs as the paramedics checked over the baby. Sarah, her face pale, turned to Jake. We almost lost her. But we didn't, Jake said, his voice firm. He reached for her hand, squeezing it. She's safe now. Sarah looked down at the tiny child, her little face scrunched up in distress. She's going to need someone, she whispered. Jake nodded. And I think I know the perfect person. As the police cars disappeared into the night and the baby was taken to the hospital for evaluation, Jake and Sarah stood in silence, watching the chaos settle. A weight had lifted. But a new journey was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat nervously in a small office at the Child Services Department, her hands clasped tightly. Across from her, a social worker shuffled papers, glancing up with a gentle smile. You understand the responsibility you're taking on, Miss Carter? Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with determination. I do. Jake sat beside her, offering quiet support. The social worker pushed a final document forward. Then it's official. You've been granted emergency guardianship of both girls. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath. She had fought for this, argued in court that no child deserved to be unwanted, and now, here she was, about to raise 2 little girls who had barely escaped tragedy. The door opened, and a nurse wheeled in a small bassinet. 2 identical baby girls lay inside, nestled together. Sarah reached forward, lifting the twin she had saved from the trash. The baby yawned, her tiny fingers curling around Sarah's hand. Jake leaned over, watching the girls. You did it, he murmured. Sarah smiled through her tears. We did it. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the battle that had just been fought. But for Jake and Sarah, this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one built on hope, second chances, and a promise that these little girls would never feel unwanted again. The warmth of the morning sun spilled through the nursery window, casting soft golden rays over the 2 sleeping infants. Their tiny chests rose and fell in unison, wrapped snugly in pastel blankets. The room, once an empty guest space in Sarah's small home, had transformed into a haven of love and security. Sarah stood by the cribs, her heart swelling as she gazed at the twins. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of court hearings, sleepless nights, and emotional battles, but she had never once regretted fighting for these girls. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Jake leaned against the frame, a cup of coffee in hand. His usual work uniform was replaced by a simple t-shirt and jeans. Something about seeing him out of his garbage truck uniform made him seem like an entirely different person. You okay? He asked, his voice low and warm. Sarah nodded, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Better than okay. Jake stepped inside, setting the coffee down on the dresser before glancing at the sleeping babies. They're safe now. That's what matters. Sarah let out a breath, one she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I can't stop thinking about how close we came to losing her. She gently stroked the cheek of the baby who had been discarded, abandoned in a fate too cruel to imagine. What kind of world lets a child be thrown away like trash? Jake was quiet for a moment before saying, "The kind that needs more people like you in it." Sarah met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. He had been her rock through all of this, fighting alongside her when others said it was a losing battle, standing by her side when she had to prove to the courts that she could give both girls a home. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jake chuckled. "I don't know about that. You're about as stubborn as they come." She smirked. "Takes one to know one." They stood there for a moment, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan filling the space between them. For the first time in weeks, the chaos had settled. The war was over. And they had won. 2 days after the dramatic rescue, Celeste Warren had been formally charged with child endangerment and attempted kidnapping. Though her wealth and influence had once shielded her from consequences, this time, the truth was undeniable. During the trial, Celeste's carefully curated persona of an elegant socialite crumbled. The evidence against her, the forged adoption records, the testimonies from the agency, and the haunting security footage of her discarding the infant, was impossible to refute. She was a burden, Celeste had confessed in court, her voice void of emotion. "I never wanted to. I never signed up for two." The judge's gavel had slammed down with finality. 10 years. No parole. Sarah had sat in the back of the courtroom that day, gripping Jake's hand as the verdict was read. She wasn't sure if Celeste had even noticed her presence, nor did she care. The only thing that mattered was that justice had been served. One evening, a month after the trial, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. An older woman stood at her doorstep, clutching her handbag tightly. Her blue eyes, etched with lines of sorrow, met Sarah's. "Mrs. Warren?" Sarah asked, blinking in surprise. Elaine Warren, Celeste's mother, nodded hesitantly. Sarah glanced back at the living room where Jake sat, rocking one of the twins. "Come in." Elaine hesitated before stepping inside, taking in the modest but warm home. Her gaze landed on Jake and the baby, her breath catching. "I had no idea," she whispered, almost to herself. Sarah folded her arms. "No idea that your daughter threw a baby away? Or no idea that she was capable of such cruelty?" Elaine's lips trembled. "Both." She let out a heavy sigh and looked at Sarah with weary eyes. "I came to thank you." Sarah tilted her head. "Thank me?" Elaine swallowed hard. "For saving her. I wish I had been a better mother to Celeste. Maybe if I had, she wouldn't have," she trailed off, glancing toward the baby again. Sarah softened. For all her anger toward Celeste, she saw something genuine in Elaine's regret. "I don't expect forgiveness," Elaine continued. "But I wanted you to know that I'll be making arrangements for the twins' future. A trust fund, for when they're older. To make sure they never want for anything." Sarah studied her. "This isn't about guilt, is it?" Elaine shook her head.
"No."
"It's about giving them what Celeste never gave them. A chance." Sarah considered it, then finally nodded.
"They deserve that."
Elaine let out a shaky breath and smiled. "And so do you." With that, she turned to leave, pausing at the door for one last glance at her granddaughters before disappearing into the night. Months passed, and life slowly settled into something resembling normalcy. Sarah had officially adopted the twins, renaming them Lily and Grace. Every night, she held them close, whispering promises of love and security. Jake, true to his word, remained by her side. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jake cleared his throat. "So, I've been thinking." Sarah turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "That's dangerous." He smirked. "Maybe. But hear me out." He took a deep breath. "I want to be here."
"For you."
"For them." He gestured toward the twins, who were cooing in a nearby playpen. Not just as the guy who helped out, but as, he hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. As family. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Jake," he quickly added, no pressure. I care about you."
"About them."
"And if you'll have me, I'd like to stick around." Sarah studied him, emotions swirling in her chest. The man who had once been just a garbage collector had become so much more, her partner in the fight for these girls, her closest friend, and now, maybe, something even deeper. A slow smile spread across her face. Jake, you've been family all along. His eyes lit up.
Yeah.
She nodded.
Yeah.
He exhaled, grinning. Well, in that case, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key, placing it in her palm. Sarah looked down at it, confused. What's this? My house key, he said. In case you ever decide you're tired of me knocking on your door every day. Sarah laughed, tears pricking her eyes. I'll think about it. He chuckled, draping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the sunset. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt at peace. No longer was she the woman standing alone in the darkness, taking out the trash with tears in her eyes.
She was a mother now.
A fighter. A survivor. And most importantly, she was finally home.